Hey, my name's Seth. In case we haven't had the opportunity to meet, I'm one of the pastors here, and I just want to say welcome, especially if this is your first time with us. We're so glad you're with us today. For those of you who are joining us online, whether it's for the first time or you're a repeat offender, thanks for being here. So I want to start off today and ask a question. How many of you are familiar with the TV show Naked and Afraid? Anybody heard of that before, seen it before? Yeah. I was introduced to this by somebody not too long ago, and I'd never seen it, and I thought, that sounds interesting. And in light of our series Wilderness, I decided to watch an episode or two. And in case you're not familiar with this show, let me just tell you what happens. They take two masochistic people who don't mind stripping bare, and when I say bare, I mean they don't have socks, they don't have underwear, there are no shoes, and they get dropped out. There are some strategically placed pixels, just in case you're curious, right? Okay, so, it's not that bare. But so they send them out into the wilderness with literally nothing. They get one item. Each person gets to choose one item that they take together. There are two people, and it's like a live version of the Hunger Games. I mean, they're just trying to survive, except they're not trying to kill each other or outlast. They're trying to work together to survive for 3 weeks. And let me tell you, it is a fascinating show. I don't know if I can recommend it or not. It's just interesting. And, they're all gung-ho when they start, and then by the end, they're like, we can barely survive, right? I mean, I don't know. I know one person who could potentially survive on that show. It's Nate. I won't point anybody out, but it's Nate. You got to be crazy. I don't know. So anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about being naked and afraid today in our series Wilderness as we bring it all to a close. In case you're curious, I don't think I'd last like an afternoon on the show, partly because I love clothes, which is a weird thing to say, but I do. But man, I'm a lover of comfort. I love air conditioning and hot food and meals and hot showers and all that good stuff. And anyway, throughout this series, we've been talking about the wilderness and how we have this interest in the wilderness, but we want it on our terms, right? We like to try and tame the wilderness. We like to try and tame the wilderness so it's not so wild. But what we've been discussing is that's not always possible. Sometimes the wilderness is wild, and sometimes whether we want to be in the wilderness or not, we get sucked into it. We didn't ask for the text message. We didn't ask for the breakup. We didn't ask for the financial challenge. We didn't ask for the medical situation. We didn't ask for COVID, right? Whatever it was. Sometimes we don't ask for it. Sometimes wilderness is we're subjected to it. And then other times we subject ourselves to it by decisions that we make. But what we talked about last week, and what I want to revisit here for just a minute, and this is so important, that how you got in the wilderness and why you're in the wilderness don't really matter. In the wilderness, we said this last week, focus less on why or how than on what now. It doesn't matter the decisions that you made. It doesn't matter the things that you were subjected to or things that happened in your life. Not that those are completely unimportant, but what's so important right now is how you choose to move forward in the wilderness and the decisions you make as you step forward in the present moment. Because the truth is, the present moment is the only moment you and I are guaranteed. It's the only moment we have, and so we have to make a decision of how we're going to move forward. And that's so significant for all that we've been talking about in this series. And this is kind of our bottom line of everything that we've been saying, that if we can emerge from the wilderness with our faith intact, that we don't wander away from God, that we don't push God away in spite of the difficulties we're going through, that if we can emerge from the wilderness with our faith intact, we'll discover a new resilience for facing life. Because here's the thing I know about you. Whether you're in the wilderness right now or not, the fact is we're all going to be in the wilderness at some point in time or another. And at some point, we'll be out of that wilderness. And the question is, can we stay connected to God in the midst of the challenge, or will we push God away? The wilderness can make or break your faith. So we've been looking at people from the wilderness throughout this series. We started off with Abraham, as Abraham learned to trust in God over anything else, even over his son, that he had his hope and promise put in. We talked about Jacob, who was constantly just fighting against God and fighting against people, fighting to get what he wanted in life. And we learned the importance of surrender and not just pushing our own agenda, but actually holding our hands open and saying, okay, God, whatever you want from me. We talked about Balaam, the crazy guy who had a donkey talk to him, and Balaam who discovered the importance that if God isn't Lord of all, then he isn't Lord at all. That when we hold things back from God, we're not actually making him Lord of our lives. We're kind of making ourselves Lord of our lives. And then last week we talked about David and his discovery that our character is forged in the wilderness, one decision at a time. And what happens in the wilderness doesn't stay in the wilderness, because what we do with our character, it follows us even when we're beyond this difficult wilderness that we find ourselves in. If you missed any of those, I'd invite you to go to our website or use our church app. You can connect and catch up on all the things we've been talking about. But today I want to go back to this whole concept of naked and afraid, and this common theme that we all have, and that's that we've all felt alone in the wilderness. Now, maybe you haven't been naked in the wilderness, but you've felt that way, right? I mean, and the interesting thing about loneliness in the wilderness is that you can be surrounded by a sea of people and still feel completely alone. My freshman year in college was the first time that I had ever, since kindergarten, had to be reintroduced to a new group of people. I grew up in the same town. We never moved. So I pretty much knew everybody I graduated with, and I had known most of them since kindergarten, right? So then I went off to college, and because I'm Mr. Extrovert, I thought it'd be great to get to know as many people as humanly possible. So, I mean, I'm just introducing myself all over the place, getting to know everyone. But the problem was I was just making a lot of acquaintances, and I wasn't getting any real deep connection with people. So after about 2 months, I found myself at this place. I'll never forget. I mean, just that feeling of, I am so lonely. And I knew all these people I could call and talk to, but none of them knew me. And in the sea of people, we can still feel lonely. In the sea of technology, I mean, isn't it interesting that we're more connected, supposedly, than ever before? But in our connectedness, we're disconnected from people. My generation was the AOL Instant Messenger generation, the AIM generation. Anyone else remember AIM when that came out? I mean, it was so exciting, right? Before text messaging, for those of you, we didn't always have phones in our pockets, right? Back in the day, we had AIM, and we would send messages to each other. And it quickly became apparent that we could have conversations on AIM that were more comfortable there, right? And we would never talk about them in person. It was like the AIM life and the real life. And we would separate those things and because it was too uncomfortable, right? And technology gave us the freedom to know people but not really be known by people. And it created just this weird disconnection. And the thing about the wilderness, this is kind of the problem with the wilderness, that the longer we're in it, the lonelier we begin to feel. When we're going through those challenging moments in life, when we're going through those feelings of abandonment, when we're going through the divorce, when we're going through financial crises, when we're going through COVID, in all those times, the longer we go through it, the more lonely we begin to feel. And it drags on for days, months, sometimes even years. And then we begin asking the question, where is God in all this? God, why haven't you stepped in to do something about this? Why haven't you responded? Why haven't you fixed my situation? Why haven't you done what I know you're capable of doing, and yet I'm here struggling, suffering, alone? One of the weirdest tensions, and this is for all of us, regardless of what your faith perspective is, whether you consider yourself a follower of Jesus or you're just kind of exploring things today, there are moments in the wilderness where God just feels so far away. There are moments where we know God could step in and do something if he was there, if he cared, if he wanted to. And so it's at that point in time when we don't feel him stepping in, when he doesn't respond the way we think he should respond, that we're tempted to walk away from our faith. It's kind of a dangerous place to be, actually, because that's when we turn to other things. That's when we turn to substances. That's when we turn to other relationships. That's when we turn to people, or we look for answers wherever we can find them. We have a term here at our church for those things. We call those pivotal circumstances. Those times in the wilderness we call pivotal circumstances because they have, again, the power to be so pivotal in our faith journey. They can either draw us closer to God or they can cause us to move back and retract from our relationship with God. They can make or break your faith. Now, what I want to communicate today, and this is so important, if you're in the middle of the wilderness, I want to offer some hope today. And I want to tell you that God is there, that God does care, even when it feels like he is abandoned, even when he's not answering the way that we want. God cares so deeply for you. But God is also kind of like a good parent. You know what good parents do? Sometimes when their kids are in trouble, they grab their kids by the hand and they pull them up and they help out. And sometimes good parents say, you just need to go through this. There are just some difficult things, and I'm here and I care about you and I'm watching over you, but there are just some difficult things that we have to trudge through in life. It doesn't mean God isn't there. It doesn't mean that God doesn't care. One thing is certain, that regardless of your faith background or your understanding of who God is, the wilderness is a guarantee. Every one of us will go through the wilderness. Even Jesus' closest followers, and we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, even his closest followers went through the wilderness. But you don't have to give up on God in the midst of it. And oftentimes, the wilderness comes on the heels of what we might call a mountaintop experience. If you've ever been to camp, or, we just had this amazing VBS week, and you're singing the songs, you're learning the things, and it just, you get the quiver in the liver, or, you feel the warm tingles, like, oh my goodness, God's so good, he loves me so much, and all that stuff. But then it's almost like after those moments, you're almost guaranteed to have this falling off the cliff moment of where is God in the midst of this? And that was certainly the case for the person that we're going to talk about this morning. Now, we don't have time to tell the whole story and look at his whole account, but if you have time later today, or I'd encourage you to make time later today, it takes place beginning in 1 Kings chapter 17. I'm going to give you my best job at kind of paraphrasing things and my most accurate way of trying to tell the story up to his point in the wilderness. But it's about a man named Elijah. Now, Elijah comes about in an interesting time in the history of Israel. Israel was started with a man named Abraham. God called Abraham. We talked about him. And then Abraham had a grandson named Jacob. It's past Jacob. It's past Moses. It's even after the time when Israel had become a kingdom, when they had kings. King David, we talked about him. He was the greatest king Israel knew. And King David had a son named Solomon. And Solomon had a son who became king whose name was Rehoboam, but he was a really bad king, and we're going to talk about him in a few weeks. But Rehoboam, he was a bad king, and because of that, the kingdom got separated into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. So what we're going to look at today takes place in the northern kingdom when they're at the point of having their 8th king, and his name is Ahab. And Ahab is married to a woman named Jezebel. I know. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. And the reason you know what I'm talking about, and the reason we know Jezebel's like a bad chick is because, do you know any people named Jezebel? No. I mean, for the same reason you don't know anybody named Judas or Adolf, right? I mean, those are names that we don't name our children because there's some history there, and we don't want them to be named that. But Jezebel, I mean, she was kind of this wicked queen who came from the Sidonians. She came from the city of Sidon, which is on the Mediterranean Sea, and she brought with her the worship of a god named Baal. Now, perhaps you've heard of Baal before, but Baal is the god of fertility, and this is an ancient stone kind of depicting. It's a little hard to see, and I couldn't find a good picture of Baal, but he's got a lightning bolt in his hand, and he's the god of fertility, which means he's overseeing crops and rain and thunder and lightning and all that good stuff. And so all the Sidonians worship Baal, and when Jezebel became the queen, she pushed the worshiping of Yahweh, the God of the Bible, the God of the Israelites. She pushed the worship of Yahweh out of the country, and she brought in the worship of Baal. Well, Yahweh wasn't real happy about this. And so he sent his prophet Elijah with a J. There's an Elisha, S-H, but we're not going to talk about him today in case I mispronounce or whatever. But it's Elijah with a J. And so Elijah comes to King Ahab, and he's like, hey, God isn't real happy with this new arrangement of him being kicked out of the nation. So just to prove that he's God, there's not going to be any rain here until I say so. And then Elijah left. God led him to leave. And for the next year and another year, and into a third year, there was no rain in the nation of Israel. It was so bad, the drought got so bad that even in Baal's hometown of Sidon, even back in the region where Jezebel had come from, there was no rain. I mean, he should be looking out for his own people, right? But the point was Yahweh wanted to teach the people, this Baal that you're worshiping isn't even a God, right? I mean, he's not even a real person. I'm the only one true God, and so you need to worship me. So they're into the third year of this drought, and Elijah goes to Ahab, and he's like, I want to talk to you, and they begin having a conversation. And Ahab, who'd been hunting Elijah, hadn't been able to find him. He was really ticked off. And so here's where we kind of pick up the account. 1 Kings chapter 18 says, when he, that's Ahab, saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" Right? I mean, he's angry because his people are suffering. Ahab is suffering. He's responsible. He's the king, and everybody's struggling right now. People are dying because of this huge drought. And he is very quick to point his finger. Now, as we talked about through this series, wilderness sometimes is something of our own creation, and we don't always like to admit that, and that was certainly the case here because God's trying to get his attention. God's trying to say, Ahab, I'm the true God. You've pushed me out. But instead, Ahab's like, you troubler of Israel, Elijah, this is all your problem. So Elijah responds. Here's what he says. He says, I have not made trouble for Israel, Elijah replied, but you and your father's family have. Don't blame this on me. This isn't my deal. This is your deal. He goes on, he says, you have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel. And continuing on, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. And you know what we're going to do, Ahab? We're going to have a showdown. And your 450 prophets, they're going to build an altar to God, and they're going to put a bull on that altar, and they're going to cry out to Baal, and they're going to pray for Baal to come down and light this fire. Because he's the God of lightning, right? I mean, he's thunder and lightning and fertility, and he can do that. That's well within his means, and he will prove that he is God. And then there's little old me on this little solo expedition, and I'm going to do it myself, and I'm going to pray to Yahweh, and we'll just see which God answers. Does that sound like a good idea, right? He goes on, here's what he said, verse 24, skipping ahead. He says, then you call on the name of your God, I'll call on the name of the Lord. And anytime you see the word Lord in the Old Testament in all capitals, that refers to Yahweh, again, the God of the nation of Israel. The God who answers by fire, he said, he is God. And then all the people said, what you say is good. So they like this plan, they're all for it. So continuing on, so they took the bull given them and prepared it, and then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. And here's what they said. Baal, answer us. Baal, we know you're up there. Answer us. But there's no response. And no one answered. And they danced around the altar they made. Like, this is a big display. Imagine 450 people dancing, yelling, Baal, please come do something. And Elijah, he's watching all this, and it's kind of entertaining, right? Because Elijah knows Baal isn't a real God. He knows nothing's going to happen, so he's just kind of, yeah, come on, In fact, he starts to taunt them. Here's what happens. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, right? I mean, surely he's a God. Perhaps he's deep in thought, right? And you need to kind of wake him up, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. I mean, you've built your life on worshiping this God. Surely he's a real God. Aren't you paying attention, right? At least he'll come to defend his honor. I mean, if he's a real God, wouldn't he come to defend his honor? Now, this all seems a little bit weird to us, but for people, thousands of years ago, the gods were kind of like the worst versions of people. They were controlling and selfish and whatever, and they did things like go on vacation and take naps, and they were kind of human-like. And so, this made total sense to them. So here's what they did. They shouted louder. And they slashed themselves, like, we're serious, Baal, with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. So midday passed, continuing on, midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. I mean, there's this big scene of 450 people dancing around, trying to get Baal to answer, and nothing's going on here. So Elijah, finally, at the end of the day, he goes to this altar of the Lord that had been torn down. He gets 12 stones, one representing all 12 of Jacob's sons, which became the tribes of Israel. He dug a trench around the altar, and he put 12 jars of water on this. So, I mean, he's like dousing this whole thing with water. And then he prayed. And here's his prayer. He said, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. And he says, answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God and that you are turning their hearts back again. Show us, God. Show us who you are. Show us that you're the real God. Make your presence known in this wilderness. And then something miraculous happened. The text says this, then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. I mean, this wasn't just a little spark. This is like a fireball from heaven, right? And when all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. Now, that's not at all shocking because honestly, if right now there were an altar here and a giant fireball from heaven came down and ignited it, you'd all be freaking out, okay? I mean, I would be freaking out, right? And I'm the paid Christian. I mean, we would all be freaking out because we're like, what is going on here? And then there's this sinking moment where you realize you've been worshiping the wrong God, and that's really uncomfortable, right? Your worldview is being challenged. It's like, oh my goodness, what have we been doing? And so Elijah, he takes these 450 prophets of Baal, and this sounds terrible, but he has them killed, and that it wasn't terrible because he was preventing the Israelites from going after a false god, right? And so he has these prophets killed, and then the sky just darkens, and the clouds come, and the rains came down, right? I mean, it just flooded, and it was incredible, and it was impressive, and people were turning back to God. Well, Ahab's wife, Jezebel, she wasn't there for the whole ordeal. We don't really know why, but somehow she missed the whole firework display. And she got wind of what had happened. And she found out that Elijah had gotten rid of her 450 prophets of Baal, and she wasn't very happy. So she sent him a message, which frankly was more like a death threat. And here's what she said. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. And she's talking about the prophets that you've killed. So, I mean, Elijah, he's just had this mountaintop experience. He's seen a fireball from heaven ignite an altar, right? I mean, incredible. And then he gets this note. Like for us today, maybe it's a text message, or the messenger message, or someone calls you up, or you get called into your boss's office. You get served papers, whatever it is. He gets this note, and it just got to him. It just ate him up. The text tells us this, that Elijah was afraid. And he ran for his life. And when he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. It goes on and says, he came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. Well, the truth is, some of us have been there before. We weren't sure it was worth going on. We weren't sure we could continue enduring whatever it was that we were enduring, whether it was the health crisis or the financial crisis or the relational tensions or something with our kids, and we just didn't know. And he cries out to God. He says, I've had enough, Lord. He said, take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. And after this incredible mountaintop experience, Elijah finds himself in the literal wilderness, wondering if his life is even worth living. Naked, afraid, vulnerable, fearful, and lonely. Now, here's what's kind of fascinating about this account. And I mean, let me just ask you, from the outside looking in, because we have the privilege of like the narrator view, right? I mean, we can see things from the outside. From the outside looking in, would you say that God has abandoned Elijah? Of course not. God used Elijah to do an incredible work. God hasn't abandoned him. And yet what he was feeling, our feelings are so powerful, and quite honestly, they're so dishonest and so unreliable But his feelings began controlling him as he began being consumed with this idea of, it's just me out here. I'm all alone. I have no one. And God answered Elijah, but he didn't answer the way Elijah wanted. In fact, what God did is he sent an angel to Elijah, and the angel fed Elijah, helped him to get some rest, and then the angel led Elijah to a mountain, and it was Mount Horeb, which, if you know much about your Old Testament history, Mount Horeb is where Moses had encountered God in the midst of a burning bush that was on fire but never consumed. And so I have to believe when Elijah, because I'm sure he knew this story too, that when Elijah was going to Mount Horeb, he's thinking, God's going to, miraculously show me his presence. God's going to show me that he's there and that he cares and he hasn't abandoned me. So he gets there, he goes into a cave, he's kind of hiding out in the cave. And here's what the text tells us, that the word of the Lord came to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here? Which is a question that's bigger than location. Like, what got you here, Elijah? What is going on? You've seen me. You've experienced my miracles. There are miracles we didn't talk about just because there wasn't time. But I mean, God used Elijah in so many miraculous ways. He saw God's presence in so many ways. So Elijah, why are you in the depths of despair? I mean, why has this threat from Jezebel just so unhinged you to the point where you want to die? What's going on? I mean, everything was going perfect until you got that note, until that messenger came and delivered that undesired message. Well, here's what he said. He answered, he replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. He goes on and says, I am the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too. It's just me, God. I'm abandoned by you. I'm abandoned by them. I am all alone. I am naked and afraid. You have left me high and dry. So the Lord said to him, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Elijah, quit moping, quit hiding. I want to show you something. I want to show you my presence. And I have to believe in these moments, I mean, Elijah's kind of expecting God to show up like he had done for Moses on that same mountain, right? The burning bush, something miraculous. So here's what the text says. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. And he's probably thinking, it's God, in this wind. It's impressive, amazing. But the text says, but the Lord was not in the wind. I mean, this grand display, but God wasn't part of it. He goes on, he says, and after the wind, there was an earthquake. Years ago, there was an earthquake in Greenwood, Indiana, where I lived, or somewhere around that area, and maybe you've even felt it here in Batesville. I don't know, but I mean, I woke up to my bed rumbling, and that's unsettling, isn't it? Imagine a huge earthquake, and Elijah's like, oh, God must be in this earthquake. Surely this is God. But the text says, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. So, I mean, God called to Elijah. He's showing up. Where is God? After the earthquake came a fire, giant forest fire, just, But again, the text says, but the Lord was not in the fire. So where is God when we need him? God, you did this huge display for the nation of Israel. Why don't you do a huge display for me? It's like when we pray, God, show me a sign, and we expect a billboard to show up on the highway. And we expect a message, to come through. It's like, God, show me the sign. And all these things, these natural disasters, they were associated with God's judgment and the power of God, but God wasn't in any of those. And it was only when the noise finally settled, when all these miraculous displays were over. Check this out. It says, and after the fire came a gentle whisper. A gentle whisper. Translated literally, it's like an almost inaudible sound. Like I have to try really hard to hear it because it's so soft. And if there's any noise, I might miss it. I think one of the problems in our world today, we just have so much noise. We have earbuds in all the time, and I'm not down on earbuds. We've got televisions on all the time or devices on all the time. We have so many things to distract us, perhaps more than any other generation in the history of the world. We don't have quiet. And it was in the quiet and in the stillness of this moment that Elijah heard God speak. And his voice, it wasn't big and flashy. It wasn't thunderous. It was almost inaudible. So let me ask you, when is the last time you created space to quiet your spirit to hear God's gentle whisper? Again, in our world today, it is just so exceedingly difficult because it requires more effort maybe than ever before in the history of humanity. Parents, when's the last time you have helped your kids to do this? And I know it's so much easier to set them in front of something and to entertain them and to never have any downtime. But when is the last time you created space for your kids to hear God's gentle whisper? Listen, for Elijah, it was when he was rested, when he was fed, when he was quiet before God, that he finally heard God speak in the midst of his wilderness. And when he heard it, check this out, verse 13, when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. There was almost something, you get the impression it was like there was something chilling about it. And he covers his face with his cloak because he's concerned about, being in the presence of Almighty God and what that might do to him and what that means, because nobody's seeing God, face to face. And he knows this, and he knows God could just destroy him, and he's so unworthy. And the voice said to Elijah, "What are you doing here?" It's the same question as before, but maybe at this point, Elijah's ready to hear it and to think about it. Like, Elijah, you've seen these miracles. You have seen my work, and now one difficult thing happens to you. And you're just plunged into the depths of despair. But do you know what, Elijah? You're not alone. God would go on to affirm to Elijah, you've got 7,000 people. There are 7,000 in the nation of Israel who have not bowed down to Baal. You feel like you're alone, but that is just an untrue feeling. You have others with you. Don't believe your emotion. Emotions are good, but they're not always reliable. And God gave Elijah strength to move forward. He gave him the power to go forward to what was next, and he gave him a new call on his life. And Elijah learned a really important lesson that I think is important for all of us, that God is always at work in the wilderness, and it's never as bleak as we feel it is. We are never alone the way we feel we are. God is always there with us. That doesn't always take away our feeling of loneliness, but when we can remind ourselves God is still here, God still cares, when we can create the space to listen and to be quiet before him. Things weren't going to be, unicorns and cotton candy for Elijah moving forward. In fact, God's new call on Elijah's life was that he was to go anoint a new king over Israel. Imagine how Jezebel would respond to that one, right? She threatens him for the 450 prophets. What's she going to do when he unseats her husband as the king? He had a difficult road ahead, but he had the promise that God was with him. And his connection with God came when in the silence, in the quiet, he listened to the gentle whisper of the Spirit of God speaking to him. And he discovered that somehow in the divine context of things, God gives human freedom and he works things out. But he is always there and he always cares. Here's the point, that even when the world seems hopeless, and there are times when it does seem hopeless. I tell you what, in the last couple of years, you turn on the TV, it just seems kind of hopeless, right? That's what Elijah felt. That's how we feel sometimes. I'll never have friends, right? I'm sitting alone at lunch again, right? I'm never going to be done with school. I'm never going to have a date. I'm never going to be home alone on Friday night. I'm never going to have a new job. I'm never going to get out of this financial pit, whatever it is. But even when the world seems hopeless, God is still in control. Man, I think about the hopelessness of the cross where Jesus' disciples who believed that he was the Son of God watched him being crucified. They saw the Son of God being crucified on a cross. And darkness overcame the whole place. And it didn't just overcome physically, it came over emotionally and spiritually. I mean, it just felt dark and they felt abandoned and they felt hopeless. But it was in the midst of that hopelessness that, let me tell you, God was doing his greatest work. He was sending his Son to forgive us, to die for the sins of the world so that you and I could have healing and hope and forgiveness and restoration, and so that we could move forward. My friends, the wilderness is an opportunity for us to draw nearer to God and in the quiet, to listen to him, to allow him to speak to us, to reassure us, to remind us he hasn't abandoned us. He is there, and he cares so deeply. But we have to create space and we have to listen for his gentle whisper. I don't know what your wilderness is. I don't know what you may be going through. Some of you kids, you're about to enter into the wilderness with school starting this week or next week. I know there's all kinds of stuff going on. I don't know what your wilderness is, but I know this. Your wilderness will not last forever. You will someday be on the other side of it. It is not permanent, so do not miss God's presence with you in it, because he is there, because he cares. And when you get to the other side of it, you will discover a resilience for facing life, for facing the challenges that you have. You'll discover a resilience that God is with you in spite of the wilderness. King David, as he was the most remarkable king Israel ever had, we talked about his wilderness last week. When he got to the end of his wilderness, when he was king over the nation, he reflected back on his years. And I just want to leave you with this because I find these words so inspiring and something that reminds me on a regular basis. Here's what he said in Psalm chapter 18. He said, "The Lord is my rock. The Lord is my rock, my fortress and my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge." So I'm going to lean my life into him. Regardless of what storm comes my way, I'm going to listen, I'm going to draw near, and I'm going to know that he is with me every step of the way. Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, I don't know what wildernesses people may be experiencing right now. I pray whatever they are, that you would give them the courage to lean into you, that you would help them to create the space for quiet in our noisy world where there is just television and podcasts and music and whatever and stuff to fill up our mind all the time. But that you would give us the courage to create a space to listen and to be quiet, to cry out to you as Elijah did, and then to experience your gentle whisper in our soul. God, we desire that. For those who are going through a wilderness right now, I pray that you would give them courage. Give them hope. Help them to know that they are not alone, that there is a God who cares so deeply for them, that he demonstrated his love by sending his Son. Thank you for that. Thank you that we get to lean into that. Father, watch over us. Give each one of us the courage to create that space, to draw near to you, and help us to hear your voice. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.